Hey, Susan Westbrook, back for session number 2 on 5-part series called Not Getting Lost in Your Loss. So this morning when we met earlier, we had a session on grief and loss, and really the main point of this whole series is in living happily ever after. So I put up a couple of charts for you to look at, and if you don't get those now, I'll post those again after this video, but I wanted to review a little bit about what we said this morning about this life of living happily ever after. Part of the concept is that life is really a fairy tale. Like real life is a fairy tale. And when we're growing up, people are telling us all the time that, you know, dreams can come true, but then we get to be adults and bad things happen and people say, well, you can't expect life to be a fairy tale anyway. Well, actually, I think life can be a fairy tale, and I think I'm living proof, and I know a lot of you out there are living proof of real life fairy tales too. So I just want to remind you of the essence of a fairy tale, and one of those charts that you can pull up will also do that. You know, the concept of a fairy tale is that people are doing pretty well in their lives, right? Everything's going pretty well. I just went to see Beauty and the Beast with my friend Linda, and you know, Belle was doing fine. The Beast, he was doing as well as could be expected, having been turned into a beast because of his bad behavior, but you know, that's another story. And life was good. And then something happens, whack. Some big change or some loss happens in the person's life. And in the fairy tale, the characters go through what I'm going to call the black box experience. Now, I know Hollywood called it, Into the Woods. It was a Meryl Streep movie. One of the few Meryl Streep movies I probably wasn't a fan of, but it's okay. I love Meryl Streep. But they go into this experience where they have to have a transformation of their character in order to get to the other end. And what I really loved about the Beauty and the Beast story is that part of that black box is that the Beast has to both become lovable and he has to fall in love. And to do that, he has to have enormous changes in who he is and how he sees himself. And he does that. And he and Belle do fall in love. And in the end, they all live happily ever after. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm after the happily ever after part. And I live in a normal life where I'm going to have a lot of change and a lot of loss. And I don't want to think that every time that my life changes or I have a loss, that I've somehow lost the fairy tale. In fact, in the last year, as I talked to you about this morning, I started a year ago believing that the fairy tale may have died. And here a year later thinking, I am the fairy tale. I am living the fairy tale. New relationship, my business is strong, and I'm about to go to Italy and finish that second book, which will be, of course, on loss and living happily ever after. So in case you missed it in the beginning, I'm Susan Westbrook. I'm a teacher and a coach and an author, and I'm here today to talk to you about loss, and particularly in this second session to talk to you about the first part of the timeline of loss, which is survival. Yeah, and we got our dino friends in here today because survival is all about being a dinosaur and going back to our very, very, very ancient roots. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. If you remember from this morning, we looked at that timeline of grief or that cycle of grief. And it starts with the event that sort of is a trauma, and I've got it on my chart as traumatic loss. We'll talk about that in a second. You go into shock, you come up through denial, and you come through that anger peak. And actually, I'm thinking that that little part of the grief continuum is the survival piece. Now, if you guys have, I'm sure that everybody out there has experienced loss at some time or another, and if you just take a second to put yourself back in the minute after the loss, I think that you can agree that there is that time where time stands still, but also the brain stops, the heart stops, maybe the breathing stops, and that nothing is really possible from there. And I'm getting a storage almost full in my site, so that's not encouraging. We might have to stop and, well, okay, let's just play this game the way it's actually played, which is in this moment. All right, am I still here? Okay, we'll see if that worked. We had a little bit of a little technical difficulty, but we'll just play along with things the way they go. So I think I was at the point of saying that when we get to that anger piece, that little squeeze between the beginning and anger, I'm going to call survival. And I was inviting you to think about a time when you had been in a lost situation and how you felt at that time. And the fact that time does stand still and that we actually can literally go into shock. And I was thinking about a way to talk about shock so that we could really understand what's happening in our brains and in our bodies when shock happens. Now I'm just thinking about when I was on the 9th floor of that hotel in South San Francisco and I was getting a Skype from 6,000 miles away that my 10-year relationship had just ended and that I had no recourse, that I couldn't go back to France because I had no days because I was there to renew my visa. So I'm just thinking about that moment of that utter shock in that time. And I was thinking back to a time when I was 5 years old. This might gross you out just a little bit, sorry. But the way our bodies manage trauma is that very often that they cut us off from a lot of our feelings and a lot of our processes. So I was 5 years old, and my dad, I'm in Claremore right now, my dad owned Love Air Conditioning downtown. And I was a chubby, exuberant child, shall we say, with a lot of enthusiasm, as most of you know I have now. And I came bounding into the shop one day from Bible school. And I was going back to the back refrigerator to get a soda out of the refrigerator. And it just so happened, I'll put my Dino guy down for a second, just so happened that on the edge of a box was a piece of metal sticking out, just like this on the edge, at the very knee level of a 5-year-old. And that as I walked across it, pretty much unconscious that it was there, that literally sliced my leg open. And I have quite the nice scar now. And the guy that was there, I still remember, his name was Carol McBride. And he was sitting on a table talking to me as I was going by. And every time he tried to get up to help me, I would take a step and that thing would open up, which I just want to say that because you'll kind of know how deep that was. So what I remember about that experience, though, of all those things happening, is there was no blood. I do not even remember there being a trickle of blood. Now, my dad might, because my dad's the one that was there, and he ultimately had to take me to the doctor, but I don't remember there being any blood. And I think that's a great example when I think about shock, that actually what happens in shock is our body shuts down, because it has to. Because ultimately it has to protect those most basic processes. So in my case, I guess my body decided my little 5-year-old self could not really deal with the pain and the blood, because I don't remember any pain either. It's pretty amazing, actually. It was like this thing happened, but I really wasn't a part of it. And actually, that's sort of how it is when we've had a traumatic loss and a really bad thing has happened to us and we don't really feel like we're a part of it, and we sort of have this out-of-body experience. And very often it's because our basic processes, the one that helped well, it's not exactly our ancestors, depending on your perspective, but helped that part of our brain actually function in the beginning, was to shut down some of those things that were going to be too much of a shock to our system. So that shock part of the timeline for the grief is a really important time, because it actually gives us an opportunity to regroup a little bit. Somebody's got a smiley face. Hope that's not for my 5-year-old self that had suffered such a bad traumatic wound. But we have to get in there and be with those basic processes, and we have to regroup. I had to just kind of go from minute to minute to get with my sister Lisa, get on a train, go see our dad. We had to do all those things, and I really couldn't afford to have a total breakdown. But I got to tell you, I wish I could have had a total breakdown. It would have been a lot more satisfying than what was happening to me in the shock phase. And then, as we remember, if you look up at the chart, or you look on the charts I put up there, that you'll go through that denial piece, and you'll have to go back and say, oh no, it really didn't happen, nothing bad really happened to me. And then we get up to the higher energy of anger. So we've gone from shock, which is literally very little emotion and very low reaction, to anger, which can be a lot of emotion and a lot of anger. And this whole chunk in here I'm calling survival, because I think we're pretty unconscious during most of this time. And we've kind of gone into our dino brain perspective. And I want to talk a little bit about dino brain for a second, because I think if you've been in this state and you know somebody that's in this state, that you can understand what's going on here. The dino brain piece is, first of all, it's extremely reactive. So, dinosaur sees food and goes after it. Really pretty reactive, very instinct driven, very self-protective. So I don't know if you can remember a time when you were in the survival phase of the lost timeline, but probably you were pretty protective of yourself. You were probably pretty, I would imagine, a little cautious about the folks that you got around, especially the ones that needed it to be okay and needed you not to be feeling what you were feeling. Those are actually not safe people when you're going through the survival phase. And I'm going to say that out loud. The other part of it is that you're kind of on total alert. Like after you've been hurt really badly, right, and you're really suffering, you're on alert, just like these guys. I mean, everybody's got a predator. Even T-Rex has a predator, right? But especially the Bronto guys, they got lots of predators because they're just fresh meat and they don't have big teeth. So we're on total alert in our dino brain, in our survival mode, because that's what we're up against and that's what we're after. Okay. So the reason I want to talk a little bit more about traumatic loss in response to the dino brain, because traumatic loss is a time in your life when you have a loss that impacts your life in many different areas. So it'd be fine if we lost a quarter, right? Most of us. Now I know there are folks who can't afford that, but let's just say most of us watching today can afford to lose a quarter. It doesn't really impact our life in too many different ways. But like a lot of you, when I was up on that 9th floor and I was finding out that my relationship of over a decade was going to end and I wasn't even going to be within 6,000 miles of the place and my life was going to change significantly, it was going to change in every area possible. Where I lived, who I talked to, how I identified, the way I spent my life, how my business ran, every single part of me was going to be impacted. That's a lot to have to handle in the beginning. Like, how do we do that? Like, how do we actually be with our child just died and it's going to change everything about my life, or my partner just died, it's going to change everything about my life, or my 35-year career just ended in a pink slip, it's going to change every area of my life. And one of the reasons we have to give ourselves an opportunity to go into survival phase is we have to process that a little bit. And it's just too overwhelming to do out there in the real world with our human brain. So we have to process it with our dinosaur brain. And I just want to give you permission to do that. If you find yourself in that place and if people are telling you to get over it or whatever, give yourself time. Because if you have suffered this kind of a loss, your life is never going to be the same again. And you need a little bit of an opportunity to get through that process. Now, there are several things that I want to talk about on my chart today. And one of the things I want to talk about is what we need. The what we need part. Okay, so I want you to go back and remember a time when you had just lost something and you were suffering at this early stage in the loss. And that what you needed, compassion, understanding, a no judgment zone. I'm going to talk about that in a second, because this summer on Facebook, several of you and myself had some interactions about the judgment and comparison that goes on when we suffer loss. But one of the things that I want to attend to initially is I want to talk about safety. One of the things that happened to me when I was in this loss process is I had no safe space. First of all, I was in a hotel, and then I was on a train, and then I was at my dad's house, and I was at my mom's house so that I could see my sister Julie graduate. It wasn't until I got to Charlotte with Robert and Laura several weeks later that I had any space at all that was private enough for me to begin the grief process. And really, I didn't have a space for it until I went to stay in England with my friend Aileen and watch her cat. And that was really the first time that I could let it all out and let it all down. So one of the things I want to encourage you to know about this process, if you don't already know, and especially if you're working with somebody who's in the early stages of grief, is that privacy and safety are pretty important parts of this system. Safety, right? Dino brain, safety. Because we're in survival mode. We're just trying to survive what's happened to us. We're trying to survive all the feelings that we feel or don't feel. We're trying to survive all the hurt in our heart. We're trying to survive all the changes in our life. And we need a sense of safety, which means that if you've got folks in your life who have suffered loss, you provide safety for them. You provide a no judgment zone, a no comparison, a no fixing it. Nothing's going to fix it. You know, I mean, I'm not even going to go there. Yeah, nothing's going to fix it, and people will try. And you know what I'm talking about. It's like when your child dies, there's no fixing it. When your partner dies, there's no fixing it. when you've lost a relationship or a career. There's no fixing it. And so if we really want to be compassionate with the folks who are enduring loss, then we know that we just want to stay out of the fix-it zone, because that's not helping them. But another thing that came up this summer when we were on the Facebook post was the judgment and comparison around loss. So I want to tell you, most of you know a little bit about me. I try to be pretty authentic, and I'm a gay woman. And I had a woman partner, right? So one of the first things that I recognized when I started this process was that people didn't really take it very seriously that I lost a 10-year relationship. Because after all, how could it be the same for me as it was for a woman who was married to a man? And I want to say that came up early on, and we talked about that on the Facebook post, because other people had experienced similar things. Like, people are very quick to try to compartmentalize our lives and our relationships. Thank you for that heart, I appreciate that. Are there to compartmentalize our lives and relationships, and sometimes don't even take our lives very seriously. And I think that just does some very serious damage. Plus, it prevents us from really going forward and being in our grief, doesn't it? Because we start to tell ourselves the same story. Oh yeah, well, I guess it's not the same for me as it would be for, a real woman who was married to a man. I'm just, my grief is kind of second-class grief, or a second-class loss here. So if you found yourself in that place, then I'm sorry. And if you also see other people doing that, you might just be a spokesperson for the no judgment, no comparison zone during the early phases of grief, because that shuts the grief process down for folks. And actually, we want folks to be able to go all the way through the grief process, because like we talked about this morning, we don't get stuck and we don't want to have to cycle. We just want to keep on moving. As a coach, that's what I'm about, forward movement. So let's do it. Let's feel what we need to feel when we need to feel it. Let's go through the different parts of the cycle when we need to, and let's get out to the other side. And we can't really do that when folks are around us comparing and judging and telling us how it's really not all that, because then we're going to shut down the grief. And I guess this is as good a time as any to bring out the mousetrap. Thank you, Mr. Hardy, for reminding me of community partners and the science lab, because it's a little bit like this. So this morning when we were talking, I talked about grief and some characteristics of grief. One is it's a very natural and necessary process. It has an arc, right? So we want to follow the arc, and we don't want to get cycling and sticking in there. But the other thing is true about grief is it's really sticky. So I'm holding one of those sticky mousetraps, and I'm going to have to tell a really bad story on myself. But first, I just want you to notice that, the thing is really sticky. So when I moved into this house in October, my sister Lisa was really kind. She saw what was happening to me. I have a lot of kind people in my life, and my sister saw that I was not her. She said, "You were not doing well." I was like, "Thank you for noticing." So she had this house, and so I rented it for a while. And in the winter, I had a mouse problem in here, because there's a big old yard back there, and there's a park over in the lakes over there. And so there's lots of wildlife. I got bunnies in the backyard. Saw them eating last night. That was so cool. But I digress to my bunny story. But somebody said, "Oh, get some traps and lay them out." And I said, "I don't want to kill the mice. Let's have a capture and release or something." Because, I'm a Reiki master, and part of every day my contemplation is, I'll be kind to my neighbor and every living thing. So I'm not going to kill the mice. So somebody said, "Well, you could try a sticky trap." Now I know you're already screaming over there, because of all the horrendous things you could do to an animal would have put one of these out. But I did. And then I discovered exactly what you already know to be true, is you can't get the mouse off here. There's the mouse. It's a worse situation than the other trap, and I was horrified. I had no idea what to do with it. But what I did learn is it's a great prop to use when we're going to talk about grief. Because if we don't handle the grief that we have right now, then it's going to stick on to every single thing that we do the rest of our lives. Until, ultimately, we have to get the plunger out, because the crap is so deep that in order for us to go forward in our life and our relationships, we got to plunge it all out. But this is about recovery, and this is for tomorrow morning. But just saying. Okay? So I'd like you to think about one of the reasons we don't impede our own grief and we don't impede the grief of others is because grief is very sticky. And if we don't deal with it now, it is going to be dealing with us and sticking to us in every single other aspect of our life as we go forward. Okay? All righty. All right, I'm checking all my notes to you to see. This isn't as long as yesterday, so I don't need to go on and on with this, but I've got these little notes up here because I'm a good teacher and I got my notes there and there. So what I want to talk about is where we're going from here. Now that we understand the dino brain, now that we understand our instinct, now we understand our emotional reactivity and where that comes from, understanding shock and understanding why we have no emotions in the beginning and maybe have more emotions at the end. And because we want to keep this natural arc going, we want to know where we're going next. So tomorrow morning, what's going to happen is that we are going to talk about the next phase, which is that we're going to talk about entering recovery. Recovery phase is where we're going to be able to have a little bit more consciousness, a little bit more clarity. We're going to keep our hearts a little bit more open, and that's actually where the work starts. Nobody's doing any work during survival. That is not a work phase. That is just surviving. That is getting yourself to a place and getting enough plan in your life and some kind of forward movement so that you know that you can make it to the next step. But the actual inner work begins in recovery. When we begin to look not just at WTF, which is the question that we ask when we're in survival, but when we actually begin to ask ourselves what has changed. What has changed about me and what has changed about my life? And then ultimately, how am I going to move forward with that? So that's what we're going to be covering in the morning at 9 a.m. Central Time, I do believe. In the meantime, I will post those charts for you so that you can have access to those. And I will also post another copy of an audio that I posted on Facebook several times, which is called Coming Out of the Fog, because it's highly appropriate for what's going to be happening between the survival phase and the recovery phase that we're going to be looking at tomorrow. And in case you're wondering about our props tomorrow, we have our Band-Aids, and we have our plunger. And of course, because one of the reasons we can't get out of recovery is because we can't forgive because we got too much resentment, so we've got our poison that we're going to have. And for my friend Martha, I will try to find something to do with these handcuffs, darling, and then I'll see you tomorrow. So until tomorrow, this is Susan Westbrook, and I didn't do this morning, reminding you that the greatest sleeps in life always begin in your heart. Keep yours open and healthy and away from the dinosaurs.